Hello and welcome to Teenagers Untangled, the audio hug for parents going through the tween and teen years, where we combine expert research and our own experience to make this whole thing much less stressful and hopefully more enjoyable. I'm Rachel Richards, journalist, mother of two teenagers and two bonus daughters. And now, have you heard people talk about others being totally psycho, or maybe a bit OCD, or perhaps they've got anxiety because they don't want to go to a party? Well, my guest today is Dr. Lucy Foulkes, a psychologist and author whose work has been hugely influential in shaping the way we think about teenagers' identity and mental health. Her group at the University of Oxford researches adolescent mental health and social development, with a particular focus on the possible negative consequences of increased public health awareness and school-based mental health interventions. She's written two books, What Mental Illness Really Is and What It Isn't, and more recently, Coming of Age, How Adolescence Shapes Us. Her work has been featured in national and international media outlets, so we're very lucky to have her here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. Thanks.
I read Coming of Age, and the stories in that book felt so real that I sometimes remember them as things I feel happen to friends. Now, what led you to actually write that book?
Well, I'd been an adolescent researcher for a while, and I was surprised when I spoke to my friends, my family, and reflected on my own adolescent years, how emotional those memories were and how strongly people felt about their adolescent self. And I felt that the research that existed and that I was doing didn't really capture that kind of emotional punch of adolescence. So I knew I wanted to write a book about adolescent development, but I wanted to kind of mix it in with some real life stories, because I think when you look at the numbers of people that are bullied, for example, it just doesn't really capture what that actually means. So I wanted it to be an emotional book because it's an emotional time of life.
Yeah, I think what's special about this book is it bridges the gap for us parents, because we forget how it feels to be a teenager and how deeply emotional it is. And one of the things you brought up, I think it was actually in your book about mental health, and about how we invent ourselves in our adolescence, and we develop this ability to understand what others are thinking and feeling about us. I think you called it mentalizing. We go from kind of being kids to then having to read between the lines and figure out what sarcasm is. Are they lying to me? This is a really complex skill we have to develop, which I think is very hard. How do you think that sort of plays out in terms of the emotional lives of teens, and how it can maybe even lead to problems?
Yeah, so it's called mentalizing or theory of mind. So it's this skill where we are aware that other people have different thoughts and feelings and beliefs and understandings on a situation relative to us, and you can do the basics of that as a child, but across the adolescent years it becomes more sophisticated, and you get better at being aware that other people have thoughts and feelings about you, and you kind of absorb that into your own understanding of yourself. In the adolescent years, what your peers think of you matters so much, and whether you belong with your peers. So it's this period of life where you're suddenly thinking an awful lot more about what other people think of you and taking that into your own self-image. And obviously that can be problematic if your peers aren't nice to you.
We often, as parents, we think teenagers are quite rebellious, but I know that you say they're socially conservative, and this is back to this need to fit in. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so they are risk takers relative to children and adults, for things where they want to have new experiences and new sensations and try out new things for the first time. But they are very conservative when it comes to social risks. So things like being different from your friends, or disagreeing with your friends, or doing something that your friends don't approve of. That is legitimately a really frightening, scary thing for a teenager to do, because the judgment that you get from your peers is so much stronger than if you were an adult that listened to music that your friends didn't like. So it's genuinely a kind of riskier thing to be different. But yes, so it's this interesting kind of combination of, in some respects they are risk takers, but in other respects, when it involves potentially standing out from your friends, they're very conservative, and actually just that fact drives all sorts of teenage behaviour.
Yes, and I'm sure that turbocharges the relationship with their online life because you have more opportunity for people to dislike what you're doing as well as like what you're doing.
Yeah, and you've got a bigger audience and more of an audience of strangers than we would have had growing up, where you are being judged by your peers, but it's by peers within your school. Whereas, yeah, online, it's the audience is different.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd love to talk about mental health because there's been a big change in the conversation. There was a cultural turning point. Can you explain what happened there and why that was important?
I think 2011 was when they had television adverts and a big kind of national campaign. That was a real turning point in the UK, at least, or in England in particular. So this big national campaign to promote the idea that mental health problems are common and that we should talk about them more and we shouldn't be so ashamed of having them. In general, those principles are really sensible and a really good idea, but I've become interested how in the years since then we've possibly overshot with our awareness, or we've had some unintended consequences where the outcomes that we wanted to happen haven't necessarily happened. And now I think there's an awful lot of noise, and in some respects we're kind of talking too much about mental health, and it's not always useful, especially for young people.
I've seen some terrifying statistics about the rises in mental health disorders in the media. How useful do you think those are?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of it, isn't there? It's useful if it leads to change that is helpful for young people. So that's a really broad goal. Saying in the media that we've got an adolescent mental health crisis leads to more funding or leads to people getting help that they wouldn't otherwise have accessed, then they are obviously good things. But it's more complicated than that, 'cause those kind of newspaper articles and the campaigns encourage people to go and get help for their mental health at the GP, and then they turn up at the GP and they're told that the help isn't there, or the CAMHS waiting list is very long, or there's no help available, or they're not bad enough to get help. So this good idea in theory about alerting people to this increase in mental health problems hasn't necessarily followed through in terms of helping parents and teenagers. It's basically terrified a lot of parents.
I think you're so right.
And hasn't necessarily been paired with access to treatment that is helpful and that works.
I think you've absolutely nailed it. And I think that's what I hear a lot from parents is this desperation that they see something going on and then they're trying to get help and they can't find it. And I think one of the things you mentioned was that there's that lack of support, but there's also the way that we as a population understand the mental health issues. For example, people say, oh, I'm a bit OCD, and they're talking about that they just like to clean a lot, where that's a complete misconstrual of what OCD actually is. And that presumably then doesn't actually help. In fact, it can hinder the support there for people who are because if they can't get the help from a professional, they're going to look into their community.
And then the gravity of that term OCD gets lost. So this is what I was originally really interested in when I wrote the book, that if you unleash a word into the public without the depth of understanding of what it involves, which is, a really serious, incredibly disabling, frightening mental disorder, OCD, if you just unleash that term without enough thought, then it takes on a life of its own and it gets a new colloquial meaning, which is, about being tidy. And then if someone really does have OCD and tries coming forward and saying that, people still don't understand.
Yes. Yes, and presumably it makes them feel even more alone because they feel like they're just being misunderstood. They have been trying to put campaigns into schools. What are your thoughts about the way that gets rolled out?
There's just so much poor quality stuff and so much noise. I agree with the theoretical principle that mental health problems shouldn't be stigmatized and that young people should know where to get help for it. A lot of what's happening in schools is an attempt to, in an affordable way, help everyone all at once and by delivering information en masse. And it hasn't really worked. But it's
Right.
and in some cases actually it's either useless, so the improvement doesn't happen, or it can make people feel worse for all sorts of possible reasons. If you really do have a mental health problem, you need more than just sitting in a classroom of people who aren't unwell being taught about mental health. But it's a sort of politically difficult, socially difficult argument to make, because there aren't available alternatives, which is giving proper one-to-one help quickly to the people who need it. But also it just sort of sounds like a good idea. Like, of course you should
Yes.
want to teach about mental health. And, I get very angry emails from people saying, that of course it's a good idea to teach about mental health in schools. And it's, very understandably, there are some people who I will never convince that these lessons are a bad idea. It's a very delicate argument.
Yes, yes. How do you go from being somebody who's, struggling a bit with something, where, they're feeling they're feeling anxious, and when does that tip into having anxiety that needs treatment and intervention? I think for parents, that's incredibly difficult.
So all mental health problems exist on a spectrum. Anxiety is a good example. So everyone has a bit of it. Sometimes as you gradually have more anxiety, it becomes more frequent, more severe, more difficult to control, and particularly important in terms of diagnosis, it starts to impact your daily functioning. So once you meet all those criteria for at a high enough level, then a professional might say that you've met the criteria for an anxiety disorder. But the problem is that if you fall just beneath that threshold, you still have some problems with anxiety, even if you have, quite a bit further down the spectrum. Added to the complication that sometimes what starts off as fairly mild might be the beginning of a more serious problem. So the challenge is, how do we draw an artificial line to say, okay, this is where a disorder has begun, because you do need to draw it somewhere for pragmatic reasons. But then what do you do about the people in the kind of grey area? And the most important thing always is that whatever you call it and whatever threshold it meets or doesn't meet, is that you take it seriously. People love to say there's regular anxiety and there's an anxiety disorder, and the regular anxiety everyone needs to stop worrying about. No, we need to take it all seriously. My kind of number one tip is that whatever you think it is, or whether it meets criteria or not, that you still validate it and take it seriously.
Yes. Yes. And my kids say that it really helps them if they know that I struggled myself with things, even if it's not the same thing as them, that actually some of the struggle is really just part of who we are. My daughter, interestingly, had anxiety attacks when she had to do public speaking. She wanted to be a debater, and she would get literally all the physical symptoms, and it would just shut her down. And no matter what she did, it didn't help. And then we just looked at all sorts of things, and then we discovered that if we put her on a course where she wasn't near anybody she knew, and they slowly taught her how to do this, then that might help her. And she's now a serious debater. And it was so interesting because I think, the treatment for somebody who feels that's, some anxiety is slow exposure to what it is that they're struggling with. Whereas a disorder is something rather different, isn't it? And that's, I think for us parents, that's one of the things we're like, well, I don't know, how am I supposed to tackle this if I can't get help?
Yeah, funnily enough, so I mean that's such a nice example story about your daughter, because one of the fundamental principles of anxiety is that you can overcome it by repeatedly being exposed to the thing that makes you anxious, but very, very gradually and with lots of support. And actually that is the same principle of what you do with someone who has an anxiety disorder.
Right.
It's just that it's like one of the core principles of CBT. So the behavioural bit of CBT is the behavioural experiment. So you kind of write out a list of gradually increasing challenges, and then you do them one by one, but with lots of help, and you practice each step repeatedly until you're not doesn't provoke as much anxiety. But there's two caveats to that. So one is that if it's really bad and at the disorder level, the young person will probably need a professional helping them. Although, I mean, to be honest, there are lots of books helping parents do CBT exercises with their children. The other caveat about that is about neurodivergence. So some autistic or other neurodivergent young people, the nature of their anxiety will not be resolved by asking them to repeatedly expose themselves to something that makes them anxious, because often their anxiety comes from a kind of sensory overwhelm, which is going to lead to a complete sort of system shutdown. And it's not reasonable to expect them to keep being
not the same.
This is why managing anxiety in schools is often so difficult, because for some students, exactly what you should do is what you described with your daughter: gradual exposure, lots of practices. And then equally for other students, that's exactly what you shouldn't do. And you need a real expert to, distinguish between the two. That's why this is complicated. But if your child is not neurodivergent, then it's worth looking up this basic CBT, graded exposure, experiments, principles, even just so you can know the general thing that they'll be learning about in therapy. Because, it's an absolutely fundamental aspect of treating anxiety.
And that's one of the lovely things that I think you've got across in your book, is that having people of A, taking them seriously, and B, having knowledge yourself. So, my first thing is if my kids say, oh, I've got this thing that's bothering me, I'll either say, oh yeah, that's exactly what I went through and I came through the other end, or I'll say, wait, I'm going to buy a book. Because there are so many amazing books out there now. Because I think actually being seen as one of the big problems, isn't it, with any of these emotional and mental problems.
Exactly, because as in being seen by a therapist.
No, just being seen, like feeling like people actually care about what you're talking about and they can see what you're saying and understand it.
I think it's just such an important principle with teenagers in general, is to attempt to, hear and reflect and acknowledge their experience and not dismiss it. But I think you really capture this struggle now, which is that some of it is normal and inevitable. And I often say that in order to live a rich, meaningful, interesting life, then there's inevitably some suffering and distress and unpleasant feelings involved. And often they're things that you just have to keep doing, and then those feelings dissipate. But you have to deliver that message really compassionately, while also taking someone seriously. Otherwise you tip into the, oh, come on, but this is just people being snowflakes.
Yes.
You should all suffer. It's just part of life. There's many different ways you can deliver that message, isn't there?
And I think that's one of the problems that we have in my generation, that I'm an old mum. I came from the generation of we just had to put up and shut up. And I think we were reacting to that and thinking, well, I don't want my kids to feel that way. And I know Jonathan Haidt, who's been in the press a lot with his anxious generation, and he wrote the Coddling of the American Mind before that. He talks a lot about not allowing our kids to actually experience real life problems and challenges. And I know in your book, you've pointed out just that teens are remarkably resilient, or can be. What are your thoughts about resilience in teens and how we can support it without ignoring the things that they genuinely are struggling with?
Yeah, I think it often gets misused or used in an unhelpful way, that resilient word, as though, the reason why we have more mental health problems today is because they're just not resilient enough. And let's go teach them about how to be resilient. It's not a straightforward thing to do. There's actually a really lovely book called The End of Trauma by George Bonanno. And he has done a lot of research into trauma and post-traumatic stress. And his argument is that even very terrible events should only ever be seen as potential traumas. Because about 2/3 of people who go through something awful don't develop PTSD symptoms in the aftermath.
Wow.
So actually the dialogue has so flipped now that it's seen as an inevitability to develop post-traumatic stress after difficult events. And he's really making the case that actually the majority of people are resilient and we can learn from them. And it's a really interesting book describing what resilience is in terms of your beliefs about still being optimistic about the future and all that kind of stuff. But some people will find it harder than others, and it's not about being weak. Some people are just more reactive to stressful events.
Yes, you had a section where you were talking about people who tend to cope better in those scenarios than others. And it really struck a chord with me because I had one of those childhoods that was actually genuinely very challenging in many ways, on, you know, on many measures, but I'm fine. And I looked through what you said in there and I thought, gosh, that is what I do. And it was when you see a problem that you look for answers. My first response is always, okay, how am I going to find the answer here? And rather than the more passive, trying to push away the feeling and perhaps using drugs or alcohol to try and suppress those feelings. And not that not that one person is better than another. It's just that actually, if you're one of those people who can actively look at ways to energize your way through something and find answers, that can be a very healthy way for dealing with these very difficult situations.
Yeah, it's about coping basically. So how do you cope in the aftermath of difficult things happening? And that's what a lot of this and George's book is about. There are various different ways you can cope in the aftermath of something difficult, and some of them are better for your mental health than others. But also that there's not like one perfect way of doing things, and even within one individual, they might draw on different techniques at different times. But I mean, not everyone will go through something terrible, but everyone who does interesting things with their life will experience unpleasant things. So yeah, I think we are doing a great service to young people if we're honest about that and talk about how you cope in the aftermath. And that's why it's not necessarily helpful to repeatedly tell parents that we've got a mental health crisis, because then they're very afraid that that's what the outcome's going to be. And I don't think that's helpful for anyone. To come back to the story about your daughter and the public speaking, it's just such a great example that something can be really scary, but if you repeatedly do it with help around you, that's often the only way that things become easier, is to keep doing them. But to have a model who is sort of living proof of that, I think is very powerful.
Really helps. So what I'd love to do now is just actually let's focus a bit on social media, because we've talked already about some of the developmental stages with teens and how they become sort of much more cognizant. And I remember my daughters, when talking to them on this podcast, saying it was almost like a light was switched on. Like before that, I didn't really notice myself. I was just happy with who I am and everything was good. And then suddenly they just became really aware of how they looked to other people. Once they sort of become aware of themselves and what other people are thinking, they really want to be acknowledged as being liked and accepted. With social media, it's quantifiable because you can have likes and then it's also very public.
Yeah, exactly. So we all care about social approval, and we certainly care about it in adolescence, but social media literally puts a number on it. So it's a number of how well liked you are, in inverted commas. It's a number that you can compare with other people, and it's a number that other people can see. So I think that there are many interesting ways that social media are a reflection of real life social interaction, but sort of changed in a certain way. And that quantifiable aspect of it is very interesting, I think.
And I think one of the interesting things you said as well is that it's almost like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So the people who started out being popular or they fit into a box, for them, it will amplify that. And then the opposite can be true.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see social media as or phone use in general, really, phone behaviour, a mirror of what's happening in the real world. So a mirror of who you are, but also a mirror of what's happening for you socially. So I think, if you're socially secure, have lots of good friends, social media is probably quite fun, but equally, the opposite can be true. I'm fairly relaxed about social media and phones relative to lots of other people. Maybe relaxed isn't the right word, but I don't think they're as bad as some commentators have promoted. I think it's actually...
Tell us more. Go on. I'd love to hear more.
I think Jonathan Haidt has not been a helpful figure here for a lot of people. He's oversimplified and misrepresented the research. This is very widely understood among researchers. If you Google his name and the word criticism, you will see there's lots and lots and lots of researchers pushing back against the narrative that he's created. He's exaggerated the problem. There was a time when we weren't worrying enough about phones and teenagers, I think.
Yes.
But I think we've
Yes.
now overshot. He's now terrified parents.
Yes.
Okay, phones can be bad, but they can also be good and they can also be neutral. They are a normal part of adult life. So I think it's normal and appropriate that teenagers should gradually get one with increasing independence, with lots of support, lots of open discussions, lots of guardrails. But I think it's completely okay for teenagers to gradually get a phone. I think the proposed solution by Haidt and other people to ban smartphones under 14, ban social media under 16 is unrealistically strict. So that solution that he's proposed has now actually caused an enormous amount of conflict within families and between parents.
It has. It has. And I'm getting that with parents emailing me.
Yeah.
Yes.
When I say those kind of messages online on Instagram, where I say, it's not that bad and you don't need to feel so guilty, I have a lot of parents saying thank you because they feel like they've somehow failed because they've given their teenager a phone. And then there's a lot of judgment and shaming across parents. Someone messaged me saying that they've been told it was giving a phone to a teenager is like akin to them having heroin. It's just
wow. Okay.
Total misunderstanding of the concept of addiction. But so I'm very keen to somehow sensitively communicate the message that there is an alternative way of approaching this. And actually, I think there's several public commentators now and writers coming out, writing books, creating Instagram accounts to try and convey this less fear-mongering, less guilt-inducing. It's okay to give them a phone if you do it gradually and with support. And I think that's just so much more realistic.
Yes, that's what Catherine Nibb said recently on my podcast. I think the big worry is that there are a lot of parents who are not engaged at all. And if your child is in a school with people who are simply not engaged and give their kids a phone at silly age, then you are now presented with a problem. And you have to have communities of people, the majority of whom accept that you were going to hold back because if you send your child out into the world, they're going to access things via someone else's device if that other person is doing things where the parent hasn't bothered to look at what the issues are. So I can see it's fraught.
It's absolutely fraught. And the parenting would be easier if phones disappeared.
Yes,
but
very much so.
Doesn't happen now. They're out there now, and it's actually now a fundamental challenge of parenting at any age. Actually, how you deal with devices and screens, it's not going away. And absolutely, as you say, that even if you're very strict within your own household and very on top of it, you cannot escape the need for the conversation because they will see some of the stuff elsewhere. And then Lisa Dammer, I think, is a US psychologist, and she writes really helpfully about this. The balance of limiting phone access but not causing social exclusion, to basically give them support them to have enough device access to help the social development, because I think it's really sad when you end up in a position where you have a young person who's begging for a phone, the parents won't let them have one. They're now very left out because there are all sorts of conversations and interesting things, fun things happening via phones that they are not participating in. And then, that there's no risk-free solution here. You can avoid giving them a phone, but then you introduce the social exclusion risks. I think it's a total headache for all sorts of reasons. But I think the solution is not to demonize phones or demonize parents or blame young people for wanting them. It's just not helpful.
No, and a perfect example today, my daughter had a Nokia phone that I gave her before she was allowed to have a smartphone, and this was when she was a teenager, because I was holding her back somewhat. And she pulled it out and she said, "Oh, I'm going to go to this because I've been on social media too much." And this is her saying this. And then she said, "Oh, wait, well, I need the app for the Stagecoach bus thing. And now I need the tickets to get into this concert. They're on a smartphone." We are now socially integrated into these devices to an extent that it's not just about what we want. It's actually about what is our social environment allowing us to do. And it becomes really, really difficult. And I think we can coach our kids to be their best selves online. And who they follow and what they're looking at. But I think we have to really engage, don't we? And that's the difficult bit. It's like we actually do have to engage.
There's no pathway through this that involves avoiding phones, unfortunately. But so much. Yeah, I know. Although there are benefits of parents having phones, previous adolescences involved teenagers, disappearing all night and you had no idea where they were. And contact with you, so there are benefits for parents as well. But yeah, two things you mentioned there which I think is so interesting. Firstly, that phones can be joyful and fun and interesting. I absolutely love my phone. I think it's so interesting, it's so relaxing. I have like immediate access to so many people that I love. I think what I've done on Instagram has been fascinating and has taught me so much. So I think I'm perfectly aware of all the problems, but I also don't think we should see them purely as problem things. I think there's so much good in them as well. And I think it's wonderful if parents can be interested in that side of it. I was just reading a new book, which isn't here, so I can't flag it, but by Erin Walsh, and she says one of the first things she asks teenagers is, what do you love about your phone? What do you get out of it? And just that curiosity and that acknowledgement that there might be something that they do love, I think can be really helpful. And then the second thing that you mentioned, which I thought was interesting, is that teenagers can actually self-regulate to an extent their own phone use, and that this is a skill that they have to learn, which
absolutely
help them learn. Every adult now who in their 30s who does all sorts of complicated things in their job, they have a phone and they grew up with a phone. So, and older than that, adults who didn't grow up with a phone, but we all now have phones, and in order to achieve various things in our life, we have learned how to regulate our use. So that's actually a conversation that you can have with teenagers. Obviously, it's very scaffolded at first, but gradually as they get into their later teens, it might be something that they decide for themselves. Will I put it in another room, etc.? So how do you, even though phones are great, how do we sort of put buffers on them so that they don't take over the other things that we want to do? And that can be an open, collaborative discussion.
Yes, and from all the research I've done, I found that the easiest way to not have arguments in a house is for everyone to have similar rules. And so, in terms of phone use, we don't use it around the dinner table. Everyone puts their phone out at night. We don't take them into the bedrooms, and the devices are removed. One of my child is less interested in handing over her things than the other one, but that's okay. And we, having had discussions, she's fine about it, and she can see the benefit, and I see the benefit myself. So it's almost like, well, if it's good for me, and then it's good for them, and if it's good for them, it's good for me. And actually it's about sort of sitting with ourselves and thinking, why should I have a different set of rules even?
This is everyone writing in this space I've seen often advocating that the adults in the house need to, well, either that you can collaboratively write rules together, and then that the adults need to follow them as well, because teenagers hate the hypocrisy of
100%. That's the instant. Immediately, my kids have got no problem with calling me out if I try and say something and they go, "Well, you're not doing it." And so, no, absolutely, it's absolutely critical. And that's one of the things about dealing with a teenager rather than a young child. You've kind of got to be honest about your own behaviour. And that's hard for us. We don't like it. I loved one of the points you made, which was that there's an element of fear of change. That the reason we don't like phones is because it's kind of new. We've got a new industrial revolution, if you like, and that I think you mentioned that in the past there were headlines about how this horrific radio thing, the radiogram that was distracting children and they weren't doing the work. And then there was the television, and I didn't have, we didn't have a television until I was 10. So it's brand new in one respect. We don't have a choice about it as parents, and it is a massive headache. But it's also that it's not a new thing in the sense that every generation has something, right?
Yeah, and like it was the same with the wireless. It was the same with video games, etc. Television. Parents of teenagers will have grown up themselves in quite a different context. Whatever the details are, they will never have had an adolescence that's identical. Although I guess one of the things I really tried to convey in coming of age was that technology advances are different in each age, but that the underlying psychological processes are the same, and that feeling of being left out, for example, that's happens across adolescences, regardless of the technological context. So I think sometimes there can be threads that can be drawn across different generations, even if the exact context is a bit different.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really interesting about social media is the extent to which when our kids gain access to the world through the phone, they are gaining a value system from outside it. So it used to be that we'd be in our family homes and we would be socialized within our family and then our smaller community and our wider community. Whereas now the big difference is that we are being given access to a much, much bigger community, and the language that's being used and the style of the values aren't necessarily anything like the values that we might have at home. Do you have any thoughts about how parents should consider that side of it? Because again, we kind of want our teenagers and our kids to follow a value path that we hold dear, don't we?
Do you mean things like Andrew Tate? What would an example?
Andrew Tate, absolutely. And with girls as well. That my daughter a while back said, "Oh, these OnlyFans models, they're making so much money." And I said, "Really? What?" And she's clearly been looking at how much money they're making. And I said, "Well, should we find out how much money they're making?" And when I looked it up, it was $150 to $180 a month. And I just said, that's the fact. But girls are being fed a narrative as well that is not, in my mind, healthy. So it's not just boys, and it's not just, there's misandry, there's misogyny, there's whatever.
Yeah, and obviously there are all sorts of dreadful ideas and content of all different sorts of things on the internet. Parents do matter as well. The young people do look a lot to their peers, but the parents remain an important influence on all sorts of different things. So I think all that can happen, given what we said about the internet's not going away, is to maintain those open conversations and to have created an environment where you do have a conversation like that with your teenager. I mean, that's great that she, however that conversation came about, but that was a conversation she was interested in having with you. And I'm sure what you went and looked up and fed back to her did influence her.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's
Yes.
that's the best you can do, really, is to model your own values and communicate them, and then hope that it's having some sort of impact.
One last question. If there's anything that you'd be able to change about the narrative on mental health that's out at the moment, or a best practice that you would like to see, what would that be?
I would like to promote the idea that not all teenagers have mental health problems. The majority of them don't.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important to acknowledge and get help for the ones that do. But it's also very important that we acknowledge that they're in the minority, so that we take them seriously when we do come across someone who has mental health problems, but also so that we don't assume everything is a mental health problem. And I fully understand how difficult this is on an individual level, but I think a lot of stress and challenge of adolescence does not fall under the realm of being clinical or pathological. And I think assuming that too readily is unhelpful for everyone. So that's one thing
I like
always
that.
promote. And also, that guess just a bit of optimism about every topic. The negative stories and headlines get clicks, and that's what we see in the media. But there's lots of, there are lots of brilliant things that teenagers are doing on phones that is relaxing and creative and fun. And
Yes.
you can be a teenager with a phone in adolescence, and it doesn't cause problems. I think that's so important as well. I'm rather fixated on the other end of things, so I'm always keen to respect all of it and take it seriously, but there are lots of happy, functioning teenagers doing all sorts of interesting things, and we should promote them as well, I think.
I know that you've said that one of the things that's happened is we've gone online bad, offline good, which isn't true.
It's not true. It's the idea that it's good to be outside and it's bad to be on your phone is a serious oversimplification, and it's teenagers who sort of bear the brunt of that because it means they're often deprived of doing things that they enjoy and find interesting. And yeah, I think they can both be good and they can both be bad.
Yeah, it's just getting the balance. Dr. Lucy Foulkes, thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending all of this time with us. I put your details in the notes. If there's a way that you would like people to get in contact with you, you've said you're on TikTok, what's the best way that people can find you?
Instagram is probably the best route.
You've got this new, is a museum of, what is it again?
Museum of Mental Health in the Media. This is a public engagement project that I'm doing with a PhD student called Isaac to try and start some public conversations about how mental health is discussed in song, TV, films and adverts. So if anyone's interested and can't find it on my Instagram, then feel free to message me. But yeah, generally Instagram messages is the best, with the caveat that sometimes takes a while to get to it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. If you found this useful, right now, send it to somebody who might benefit. If you would like to give it 5 stars, feel free. You can find my details on www.teenagersuntangled.com. You can email me at teenagersuntangled@gmail.com. I think that's it for now. If you have any other ideas of things you'd like me to discuss, just send me a message. And have a great week. Big hug. Bye-bye.